Saburo Sakai nursed his shattered Zero back toward Rabaul in late 1942, barely keeping the aircraft in the air. The fighter was riddled with damage, its fuel leaking, its pilot exhausted and shaken. What Sakai reported after landing should have changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. Over Guadalcanal, he had encountered something new, an American fighter that behaved nothing like the planes he had been destroying since 1941. It was faster in a dive. It could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart. And it did not fight the way American pilots used to. Sakai was not an inexperienced flyer. He was one of Japan's most celebrated aces, credited with more than 50 aerial victories. When men like Sakai spoke, their words carried weight, at least they should have. He warned his superiors that the enemy had learned, that American aircraft and tactics were changing, and that the Zero was no longer untouchable. His commanders dismissed him. They told him American pilots lacked skill. They insisted the Zero was still supreme. They accused Sakai of making excuses for difficult encounters. No changes were ordered. No warnings were passed down. Within a year and a half, almost every pilot Sakai had flown beside would be dead. To understand how that happened, and why it didn't have to, you first have to understand what Japan's pilots believed they were fighting with, and what they were actually up against. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero reigned supreme. When Japanese aircraft first appeared over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots were stunned by what they encountered. No Allied fighter in service could match the Zero's combination of speed, climb rate, maneuverability, and range. It could outturn anything it faced, outclimb most opponents, and remain airborne for hours longer than its adversaries. In air combat, where seconds and positioning meant life or death, these advantages were decisive. Japanese naval aviation had been designed with a singular purpose: achieving air superiority at any cost. To do so, engineers stripped the Zero of armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, reducing weight to an absolute minimum. The result was an aircraft of extraordinary agility, capable of tight, almost impossibly sharp turns and rapid changes in altitude. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Zero seemed to defy the basic limits of flight. Allied pilots quickly learned that attempting to dogfight one was usually fatal. The men flying the Zero were as dangerous as the aircraft itself. Pre-war Japanese pilot training was among the most rigorous in the world. Naval aviators underwent years of instruction, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before ever seeing combat. By contrast, many Allied pilots in the Pacific were relatively inexperienced, rushed into action with minimal preparation as Japan's offensive exploded across Southeast Asia. When these two forces met, the outcome was often brutally one-sided. From December 1941 through mid-1942, the Zero carved a path of destruction through Allied air forces. Over the Philippines, American fighters were overwhelmed and destroyed on the ground and in the air. In Malaya and Singapore, British pilots flying obsolete or outclassed aircraft were cut down in droves. Over the skies of Burma and the Dutch East Indies, Dutch and Commonwealth squadrons were shattered almost as soon as they entered combat. In many engagements, Japanese pilots claimed kill ratios approaching 12-to-1, numbers that would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances, yet were borne out by the wreckage scattered across airfields and jungles. What made the Zero especially terrifying was its unpredictability. Allied pilots described Japanese fighters that appeared suddenly out of the sun, struck with lethal precision, and vanished before any organized response could be mounted. Radio communications were often chaotic or non-existent, and formations dissolved under the pressure. Entire squadrons were wiped out in a matter of days, sometimes hours. Survivors struggled to explain what they had faced. Allied intelligence, however, initially refused to accept the implications. Reports detailing the Zero's extraordinary performance were frequently dismissed as exaggerations born of panic, or blamed on poor tactics and inferior pilot training. Pre-war racial and technological assumptions played a role as well. Many Western planners simply could not believe that Japan, widely viewed as an industrial inferior, had produced a fighter superior to anything Britain or the United States possessed. but the evidence was undeniable. Aircraft losses mounted at a catastrophic pace, and the pattern repeated itself across every theater the Zero entered. The victories were real, and they reshaped the air war in the Pacific almost overnight. For Japan, this early success created a powerful and ultimately dangerous illusion. The Zero seemed unbeatable. Japanese doctrine appeared flawless. And as long as that belief endured, there was little incentive to adapt, innovate, or prepare for the moment when the enemy would finally learn how to fight back. The Zero's brilliance came at a price. To achieve its extraordinary range and agility, Japanese engineers stripped away almost everything that added weight. The aircraft carried no armor to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Survivability was sacrificed completely in favor of performance. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate decision. Japanese planners believed combat would be decided by skill, initiative, and aggression. A lighter aircraft, they argued, would strike first and never be hit. Defense was unnecessary if offense was perfect. In practice, this meant that a single well-placed incendiary round could turn a Zero into a burning wreck. The aircraft that ruled the skies in 1941 carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. In mid-1942, that weakness was finally laid bare. During a raid on Alaska's Dutch Harbor, a Japanese pilot crash-landed his Zero on Akutan Island. He died on impact, but his aircraft remained largely intact. For the first time, American engineers and pilots could examine Japan's most feared fighter in detail. The captured Zero was repaired, flown, and pushed to its limits. The results were eye-opening. At low speeds, the aircraft was extraordinarily maneuverable. But as speed increased, its controls stiffened. Above a certain threshold, it could not roll effectively or respond quickly. American tacticians drew a simple conclusion: never fight the Zero on its terms. New doctrine followed. American pilots were instructed to avoid turning fights, use altitude and speed, attack in diving passes, and disengage before the Zero could respond. Survival, not heroics, became the priority the Americans had learned, and they immediately began applying those lessons in combat. American adaptation did not end with new tactics alone. While pilots learned how to survive the Zero, American industry moved with overwhelming speed to ensure they would eventually dominate it. The result was a new generation of fighter aircraft designed not for elegant dogfights but for brutal, decisive air combat aircraft, built to exploit every weakness the Zero possessed. The first of these was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. From its earliest design stages, the Hellcat was conceived as a direct response to the Mitsubishi A6M. American engineers studied combat reports, pilot debriefings, and captured intelligence to understand exactly how the Zero fought and how it died. The Hellcat did not attempt to outturn the Japanese fighter. Instead, it emphasized speed, firepower, survivability, and ease of use. It was larger, heavier, and far more rugged, powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney engine that gave it superior speed. Especially in a dive and at higher altitudes. In combat, these characteristics proved decisive. Hellcat pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage. They attacked from above, struck with devastating bursts from 6.50 caliber machine guns, and then used their speed to climb or dive away before Japanese pilots could respond. Crucially, the Hellcat was built to protect its pilot. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks meant it could absorb punishment that would instantly ignite or disintegrate a Zero. Many Hellcats returned to their carriers riddled with holes. Aircraft that simply would not have survived in earlier battles. Even more transformative was the arrival of the Vought F-4U Corsair. Sleek, powerful, and unmistakable, the Corsair represented the full maturation of American fighter design. It was one of the fastest piston-engine fighters of the war, capable of outrunning nearly every Japanese aircraft it encountered. Its massive engine and distinctive inverted gull wing gave it exceptional performance at speed, while its heavy armament delivered lethal firepower in a single pass. Japanese pilots quickly discovered that the Corsair was a deadly opponent. It could dive faster than the Zero, climb away after an attack, and withstand damage that made return fire largely ineffective. Attempts to dogfight it ended badly, and attempts to flee often failed. The psychological impact was immediate. Where Zero pilots once entered combat with confidence, encounters with Hellcats and Corsairs introduced hesitation and doubt. By 1943 and 1944, the shift was undeniable. American fighters were no longer merely surviving, they were hunting. Kill ratios swung dramatically in the opposite direction, and Japanese air units began suffering losses they could not replace. Training pipelines collapsed, veteran pilots disappeared, and inexperienced replacements faced aircraft they could neither outrun nor outfight. The balance of power in the Pacific skies had changed. And it was not a gradual transition, it was a violent reversal, driven by industrial power, ruthless adaptation, and aircraft built not to impress, but to win. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. Over Guadalcanal, engagements no longer followed familiar patterns. American fighters attacked from above, struck once, and vanished into the clouds. They no longer lingered. They no longer turned. Veteran pilots reported what they were seeing. They asked for improvements to the Zero, more armor, better protection, greater speed. Their requests were denied. Saburo Sakai's own experience became a warning no one wanted to hear. During combat over Guadalcanal, he was struck in the head by a bullet, blinded in one eye. Bleeding and barely conscious, he flew hours back to base and landed his aircraft. After recovering, he returned to the air, and what he saw alarmed him. The Americans were disciplined. Their formations were coordinated. Their aircraft could survive hits that would have killed a Zero pilot instantly. Japanese commanders responded with familiar words. Victory, they insisted, depended on fighting spirit. Technology was secondary. Determination would overcome material disadvantage. Reality disagreed. By 1942, the war had become a contest of production as much as skill. And this was a contest Japan could not win. American factories were producing aircraft in numbers Japan could not approach. For every fighter Japan built, the United States was building several and improving them with each new version. Training told the same story. Japan had entered the war with a small cadre of exceptionally skilled pilots, veterans of years of combat in China. But losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. New pilots arrived at the front with a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed, American pilots. By contrast, entered combat with hundreds of flight hours and continuous access to training and replacement aircraft. The qualitative edge Japan had enjoyed at the start of the war was eroding rapidly. Mathematics was taking control of the battlefield. The consequences became impossible to ignore. In June 1944, near the Mariana Islands, the Japanese Navy launched its largest carrier air operation since. Midway, wave after wave of aircraft were sent toward the American fleet. They were intercepted long before reaching their targets. American fighters, guided by radar and coordinated by radio, tore through Japanese formations. Pilots with minimal training found themselves facing experienced opponents in superior machines. The result was catastrophic. In 2 days of fighting, Japan lost hundreds of aircraft. American losses were a fraction of that number. The exchange was so one-sided that American pilots gave it a grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's carrier air power was effectively destroyed. By late 1944, Japan's air war had reached a breaking point. Conventional tactics were no longer producing results, and the losses suffered by Japanese air units were catastrophic. Experienced pilots were gone, aircraft were inferior, and American air defenses had grown overwhelming. Faced with this reality, Japanese leadership searched for a way to inflict meaningful damage despite the collapse of their conventional air power. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi put forward a grim proposal. The concept was brutally simple: kamikaze attacks. Rather than attempting increasingly futile bombing runs against heavily defended American fleets, young pilots would fly explosive-laden aircraft directly into enemy ships. The aircraft themselves became guided weapons. trading pilot survival for the possibility of penetrating dense anti-aircraft fire and fighter screens. On paper, it offered a way to bypass American technological and tactical superiority by relying on human resolve instead. The proposal shocked many veteran aviators. These men had spent years mastering aerial combat, navigation, and carrier operations. To them, kamikaze missions represented not honor, but waste, a final admission that Japan could no longer fight a modern air war. Entire generations of carefully trained pilots were now being replaced by teenagers with only the most basic flight instruction. Sent into combat with no expectation of return, yet the harsh truth could not be ignored. Conventional attacks had already become near certain death. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, was now outclassed in every measurable way. It lacked speed, protection, and firepower, and it offered its pilots little chance of survival against American fighters and shipboard guns. Japan's training system, once elite, had collapsed under relentless attrition and fuel shortages. There were not enough instructors, not enough aircraft, and not enough time. What remained was courage, but courage alone could not change the balance of power. Kamikaze operations were born not from fanaticism alone, but from strategic desperation. They were a final attempt to extract value from sacrifice when skill, technology, and experience were no longer available. In the end, kamikaze attacks underscored a tragic reality. Japan still had men willing to die, but no longer had the means to help them win. The surviving aces were blunt in their assessments. They knew the war was lost long before the surrender. They spoke of commanders who refused to accept change, who blamed pilots for failures rooted in technology and production. The Zero, once a masterful weapon, had become a liability. By the final months of the war, many were no longer fighters at all. But flying bombs, only a handful of Japan's elite pilots survived. Their accounts were consistent and unforgiving. The tragedy was not simply defeat, it was that defeat had been predicted, explained, and ignored. The warnings had been clear. The consequences were final. The pilots who survived the war spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what had gone wrong. Their answers were remarkably consistent. The problem was never courage. It was never a lack of willingness to fight. It was a system that punished honesty and rewarded denial. Japanese military culture did not tolerate bad news. Officers who reported failures were disgraced. Pilots who described enemy improvements were accused of weakness. Each warning that reached headquarters was filtered, softened, or dismissed entirely. By the time reality could no longer be ignored, there was nothing left to save. Commanders placed their faith in an idea that could not be measured or tested. They believed fighting spirit could overcome any disadvantage. When aircraft were outclassed, they demanded more courage. When pilots died, they blamed insufficient resolve. Reality was treated as a morale problem rather than a strategic one. Saburo Sakai was clear about what that cost. He said they told their superiors the Americans were improving. They were told to fight harder. They said they needed better aircraft. They were told their spirit was weak. When they said they were dying for nothing, they were told to die with honor. Tetsuzo Iwamoto was even more direct. He said he survived because he learned early that the Zero could no longer protect him. He avoided battles he could not win. The pilots who believed what their commanders told them did not survive long enough to write memoirs. The tragedy of the Pacific Air War was not that Japan lost. It was that it lost after its own pilots explained exactly how defeat could be avoided. The warnings were clear. The evidence was overwhelming. The cost of ignoring it was paid by young men who never had a chance to learn, adapt, or live. History records victories and defeats, but it also records lessons. And this one is written in the words of the men who were sent into the sky, told to rely on spirit and left without the tools to survive.